There was a moment just before sunrise on the 25th of June, 1876, when a handful of Crow Scouts and their half-French, half-Sioux interpreter stood on a rocky knob called the Crow's Nest and looked west across the broken plains of Montana. The air was still, the light was thin and gray. Below them, in the valley of the Little Bighorn, lay not a village, but a city on the move, tipis by the hundreds, maybe 1,000 or more, stretching along the river for miles. Smoke rose from cook fires and soft columns, and the pony herd, God, the pony herd, it looked like a dark lake, thousands upon thousands of animals grazing in every direction the eye could travel. The Scouts had seen plenty of Sioux and Cheyenne camps in their time. This was something else. This was the largest gathering any of them had ever laid eyes on. They turned their horses and rode back to the command. They had to tell Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer what they knew, because he needed to know it, and he did know it. That's the part no one ever really talks about. To understand that morning, you have to understand who these Crow Scouts were and why their word carried weight. They weren't green recruits. They were warriors who had fought the Sioux. For generations, their lives and their people's survival depended on reading the land and reading the enemy better than anyone. Half Yellowface led them. White man runs him, goes. Ahead, Harry, Moccasin, Curley, they were all there. And riding with them was Mitch Bouyer, the civilian scout and interpreter who had lived among these tribes his whole life. These men didn't guess. They measured. They counted lodges by the way the smoke drifted and the way the grass was cropped. And when they reached Custer, they laid it out plain. Bouyer spoke first. He pointed back toward the valley and said, "If you don't find more Indians in that valley than you ever saw together before, you can hang me." Custer gave him that quick, cocky smile he was famous for and shot back, "It wouldn't do a damn sight of good to hang you, would it?" The man laughed, but the laughter didn't last, because half Yellowface stepped forward next. He looked Custer straight in the eye and, through Bouyer, said the words that still raise the hair on your neck when you read them today. "You and I are both going home tonight, by a road we do not know." Custer listened. He nodded. He even climbed a little higher to try to see for himself. But the haze and the distance played tricks. He couldn't make out the full scope the way the Scouts could. So he did what commanders sometimes do when the numbers don't fit the plan they already have in their heads. He called it exaggeration. He said the Scouts were seeing things bigger than they were. He said they had the hostiles now, caught flat-footed, and all that was left was to finish the job. But here's the thing that gets left out of most retellings. Custer didn't just hear the Scouts that morning. He had been hearing warnings for days. He had been gathering intelligence the entire march up the Rosebud, and he knew in his bones that this wasn't an ordinary summer village that would scatter at the first sign of blue coats. He knew because his own Crow and Arikara Scouts had been tracking the trail for weeks. They had followed the signs left by thousands of lodges, hundreds of travois dragging through the grass, and a pony herd so large it had eaten the prairie down to bare dirt in places. He knew because the trail wasn't old and cold. It was fresh, it was hot, and it was getting bigger every mile. He knew something else too, something the textbooks rarely dwell on. Back on the steamer, far west, before the column ever left the Yellowstone, General Terry had laid out the plan in no uncertain terms. Custer's 7th Cavalry was to sweep south along the Rosebud, locate the hostiles, and pin them until Terry and Gibbon could close the trap from the north. No solo. Charges. No glory rides. Coordinate. That was the order. Custer had sat there and listened. He had saluted. But he also knew the clock was ticking on his career. He knew the newspapers back east were already calling him a glory hunter after the Black Hills expedition 2 years earlier. He knew that if he waited, if he played it safe, the credit might go to Terry or Gibbon or anyone but him. And he knew, because he had done it before at the Washita in '68, that a Lightning strike on a village could turn a lieutenant colonel into a national hero overnight, so he pushed hard. The regiment marched day and night. Men and horses were bone-tired by the time they reached the divide. Custer barely slept. He rode up and down the column, restless, eyes scanning the horizon. When his scouts brought in reports of Sioux hunting parties and fresh sign, he didn't slow down. He sped up, because slowing down meant giving the village time to break camp and melt into the Badlands the way they always had before. That was what he knew from every previous fight on the plains. Indians ran, they scattered, they lived to fight another day. That was the pattern. That was the lesson every frontier officer carried in his head. Except this time, the pattern was breaking, and Custer knew it was breaking. His scouts had told him the village wasn't moving. Not yet. They had told him the warriors weren't slipping away in small bands. They were staying put, gathering. And still, he pressed on. Because the other thing he knew, the thing he had learned the hard way in the Civil War and in every Indian fight since, was that hesitation got you killed just as surely as recklessness. So he chose the second. One, by the time the regiment crossed the divide and dropped into the valley, the scouts had given him one more piece of intelligence that should have stopped him cold. They had spotted dust, clouds behind them. Sioux lookouts had seen the column. The element of surprise, the one thing Custer was counting on, was already gone. The hostiles knew the soldiers were coming, and yet he kept the pace. He split the regiment anyway. Major Reno to the south with 3 companies. Captain Benteen to the left with 3 more, and the pack train, himself with 5. Companies straight north along the bluffs. The classic hammer and anvil he had used so many times before. The scouts begged him one last time. They pointed to the valley floor and said the camp was too big, too strong. They said the ponies alone told the story. More animals than the 7th had bullets. Half Yellowface repeated his warning. Bouyer repeated his. Custer heard every word. He even sent a courier back to Benteen with a note that said, in effect, "Come quick, big village." He knew. He put it in writing. But he didn't wait. He didn't consolidate. He didn't pull back to high ground and let the trap close the way Terry had drawn it on paper. Why? Because the man who had charged at Gettysburg, who had led the Wolverines through the bloodiest fights of the war, who had built a reputation on audacity, believed he could still bend the situation to his will. He believed the 7th, his 7th, could punch through, where others would falter. He believed the Indians, even in numbers this large, would break when they saw the guidons snapping in the wind. He believed it right up until the moment the first volleys cracked across the river and Reno's men came streaming back out of the valley in a panic. You can almost see the change on his face in the accounts that survive. The scouts who stayed with him, Curley, the ones who slipped away before the final stand, said Custer watched Reno's retreat through his field glasses and realized, maybe for the first time that day, that the village wasn't running. It was surging. Warriors poured out of the tipis by the hundreds, then thousands. They didn't scatter, they didn't melt away, they formed up and came for him. And still he pushed north. He tried to find a ford, he tried to hit the village from the other side, the way the plan had called for. But the numbers the scouts had given him, the numbers he had dismissed as exaggeration, were now a living wall of horsemen. Crazy Horse, Gall, Sitting, Bull's nephew, White Bull, men who had fought Crook to a standstill on the Rosebud just 8 days earlier. Custer knew about the Rosebud fight, or at least the reports that had trickled in. He knew the Sioux and Cheyenne weren't the broken, starving bands the Indian Bureau had painted them as. They were well-armed, well-mounted, and fighting for their homes. He knew it. But he had bet everything that his speed and his reputation would outweigh their numbers. The rest is the story every school kid thinks they know. Custer's companies formed a skirmish line on the ridge. The firing grew heavier, the circle tightened, men fell, horses screamed, the last organized resistance crumbled somewhere near what we now call Last Stand Hill. Custer. himself was found among the dead, 2 bullet wounds, one through the temple. The body of Mitch Bouyer lay not far away. Bloody Knife, the Arikara scout who had ridden with Custer for years, was cut down early in Reno's fight. Half Yellow Face's prophecy had come true for both of them, but the story that matters, the one that still stings, isn't just the last stand. It's everything that came before it. The intelligence that reached Custer in clear, unmistakable terms. The warnings he received from men who knew the enemy better than he ever could. The facts he acknowledged in writing to Benteen. The pattern he had seen broken with his own eyes. He knew the village was massive. He knew the surprise was lost. He knew his men were exhausted and his ammunition limited. He knew the orders called for caution, and he knew, deep down, that this fight was different from Washita, different from the Republican River campaigns. He knew it all, and no one listened. Not the high command back east who had sent him out with too few men and too much pressure. Not the officers who might have questioned the pace but followed their colonel anyway. And not Custer himself, who had spent a career turning risk into legend and couldn't bring himself to turn back when the legend finally demanded it. Years later, the survivors and the scouts would sit down with investigators and try to put it into words. White Man Runs Him would repeat Half Yellow Face's warning almost exactly. Curley would describe the moment the warriors swarmed the ridge and say the soldiers never had a chance once Reno broke. Even the Sioux and Cheyenne who fought there, men like Wooden Leg and Red Horse, would later tell interviewers that the soldiers rode straight into a force they could not have imagined if they had only listened to the men who had seen it first. History loves the romance of Custer's last stand, the long hair, the saber, the defiant last bullet. But the real tragedy isn't the charge itself. It's the quiet moments before it, the crows. Nest at dawn, the scouts' urgent voices, the colonel's quick smile and quicker decision, because in those moments George Armstrong Custer wasn't blind, he wasn't betrayed, he wasn't out of information. He was in possession of the clearest warning any commander could ask for, and he chose to ride past it. That choice didn't just cost him and 260 of his men their lives, it changed the way the country dealt with the Plains tribes forever. It handed the Sioux and Cheyenne one last brief victory before the reservations closed in. It turned a tactical blunder into a national myth. And it left us with a question that still echoes every time we stand on that ridge and look down at the river valley where the grass still grows over the pony tracks. What if, just once, someone had listened? What if Custer had done what the scouts begged him to do? What if he had waited for Benteen? And the pack train? What if he had pulled back to the high ground and let Terry close the trap? The way the orders intended, the village might have slipped away, the war might have dragged on. But 260 men, good men, exhausted men, might have lived to see another sunrise. The Crow Scouts might have gone home by a road they did know, and the man who became a legend might have lived long enough to become something more complicated than a martyr. But that isn't what happened, because on that hot June morning in 1876, George Armstrong, Custer knew exactly what he was riding into. He knew the size of the village, he knew the strength of the enemy, he knew the risks. And in the end, the only voice he truly listened to was the one that had carried him through every fight before, the one that whispered that audacity would win the day again. It didn't, and the silence that followed that decision still speaks louder than any bugle call ever could.